everybody, and welcome to Barn Star Sampler month number 2. Now this month we are going to do block number 7. Nope, that's not it. There we go. Block number 7, and we're going to be making 2 of these. Now they end up being the same size block as block number 8, which we made last month, so 16 inches square. And I'm absolutely thrilled about everybody showing their blocks when they get them done on Facebook. It's really interesting to see all the different color combinations. And speaking of color combinations, I have decided that these will be my fabrics. So what we need is fabric 14, fabric 16, fabric 27, and fabric 22. So for this month, this one is going to be my fabric 14. So that will be right in here for this part right here. For my fabric number 16, this is going to be the background fabric. And I've also made a small change because I want to put this, I'm calling this fabric 16B, is going to be right in here. Now with the way the pattern is written, this fabric and this fabric are the same. I'm just going to split them up. I'm going to have gray in my background, and I want a little punch of light green right here. So fabric number 27 is the light gray right here. I'm going to use this kind of misty blue. And for the centerpiece, which is fabric 22, the very centerpiece, so the dark indigo, and I'm just going to put a little bit of color in there by adding this kind of peachy floral. So go ahead and choose all your fabrics, and remember it's scrappy, so anything goes, and then we'll get started with the cutting. Now, as the same as last month, the cutting instructions are for 1 block, and we're making 2. So we need to double up these cutting instructions as we go. So the first one, it's wanting from the Aqua Floral, which on here is fabric number 14. So this is my fabric number 14. I will need to cut 24 3-inch squares. It says for 12, but because I'm making 2 blocks, I need 24 3-inch squares. And down here we need 8 of this one, 8 of this one, 8 of this one. So double everything you need for the number of pieces. So let's get started with that cutting. Okay, so from your fabric number 14, we need to start by cutting 24 3-inch squares. So if you are cutting from width of fabric, you would need 2 3-inch strips that we will then subcut down. If you're cutting from a fat quarter, like I am here, I'm going to need 4. So we'll go ahead and first of all, let's tidy up that edge, making sure that we're straight. Okay, and I do have my fat quarter folded in half, and I am cutting what would be width of fabric if this were a full width. So here's my salvage. So if this were a full width of fabric, this edge would also be a salvage. So I'm still cutting width of fabric. I am just cutting 4 strips instead of 2. So go ahead, and we want to start by cutting either 2 strips or 4 strips. There we go. Okay, so I have my 4 strips cut. Again, with the fabric, you'll have 2. I'm going to keep this out for just a minute, just in case we make a miscellaneous boo-boo while we're cutting these. So now we need to cut these into 3-inch squares. And I'm pretty sure that I mentioned it on the last video, but I don't like to cut more than 2 layers deep. Just because you start to lose some accuracy if you start to cut more than a couple of layers deep. So I'm just going to lay 2 of my strips, one on top of the other. And I do spend a little bit of time fussing to make sure that they're right directly on top of one another. If this were full width of fabric, I would just leave 1 of my strips just folded in half. Okay, so now we're going to start cutting this up into 3-inch squares. Now because we need 24 of these, you will be using pretty much the entire 2 strips or 4 strips. You'll use all of your fabric. That's why I left this one out in case I have a miscellaneous boo-boo. I might have to cut another strip. but we should be able to get everything we need out of the fabric strips that we have cut. And we're just going to continue cutting until we have 24 of these. And then go ahead and label them piece A. And we can put them off to the side until we're finished the rest of the cutting. There we go. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Oh, we're going to be good. No problem at all. So finish your cutting, label those A, and then we'll do the next piece. So I've labeled these A, and I didn't need this, so this can now go back in the box and we can use it later on. Okay, we are now going to cut our light aqua print, or number 16. So in my case, I'm using the gray, but then I wanted to add a little punch right here around the center block with this kind of limey green. So if you are doing the same thing, where you're putting a separate color for the part around the center block here, then this last cut right here, piece number G, will be out of this fabric. All the rest of these cuts are going to be out of the other fabric 16 that you're going to use. Okay, so let's get started with the background. Okay, now for this cut, I am actually using full width of fabric, just because that's what happened, that piece of fabric happens to be full width of fabric. You can do this cutting with a fat quarter, but it's going to use the whole entire fat quarter. And that would be everything if you were doing the same fabric all the way around. If you're doing a little one separate here, then a fat quarter will also work. So when we get started, we are going to need 3 full width of fabric, or 6 strips if you're doing a fat quarter, 3.5 inches wide. So I'm just going to start by taking that nasty edge off. And now we're going to cut 3.5 full width of fabric, or 6 3.5 fat quarter. There we go. Put the rest of this away. Get it off the table. Alrighty. So now, open that strip out. I'm going to take off my selvage. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to cut 3-inch strips, 3-inch slices. And we're going to label them B. Now we're going to need 8 3-inch slices. So we'll start with that. There we go. Okay, there's my 8 3-inch slices. So we're going to label those B, stick them off to the side. And now we need 8 6-inch slices. There's 2 out of the one strip. Now save this, because we might be able to use it. Grab another strip. Take off that selvage. We don't want that in our quilt. Makes for 4, 6, 8. Label those. I'm guessing C, and I would be correct. C. Now we want to do 8 5.5s. And let's see if we can get those out of our cutoffs. And we can. So that'll be 1. Can I get it out of this piece? Should be able to. 2. Open up my next strip. I guess those need to go to the ironing board and get a bit of a press before we use them with anything. That's 4, 6. There we go. And we're going to label those ones F. Now I've got a little bit left over. I'll put it back in the bag, but we might not be able to use it for much. If you are using this same fabric for the center right here, you still need to cut another 8 3-inch squares. So for me, I'm going to take it out of this, and this isn't even a fat quarter. There's left over from something that I did. I am going to go ahead and just cut a full 3-inch strip from here and cut this into 4 3-inch squares, and I'm going to label that G. Sorry, no, I'm going to cut it into 8 3-inch squares and label that G. Oh dear, I think I'm going to need to cut more. One more 3-inch square. So I'll busy myself with that. Okay, now grab your fabric number 27, and we need, if you are cutting full width of fabric, you're going to need 2.3 strips, but we don't cut 0.3 of a strip, so you'll cut 3 strips. If you're cutting from a fat quarter, we can probably get away with 5 strips, and they need to be 3 inches wide. So go ahead and cut however many strips you need, depending on what you're using. And again, I'm cutting width of fabric. If this was a width of fabric, I'm still cutting selvage to selvage. And ooh, just gonna make it. There we go. All right, so now we need 8 5.5. So I'm going to line up a couple of them. Make sure they're perfectly lined up on top of one another. And cut away that selvage. And here I want 8 5.5s. Sometimes I wonder, with all the fussing that you do to make sure your strips are lined up perfectly on top of one another, sometimes it would just be faster to cut single. Okay, there's 6. I'm going to save this because I can get my next cuts out of there. And grab another 2 strips. There's my 8 5.5s, and now I need 16 3-inch. There's 10. I'm gonna get a couple from my leftovers. 12. 16. Okay, we are going to label the 5.5s D. So these are your D's, and these are your E's. The 3 inches are E's. So the last fabric we have to cut up is the, what she's calling the indigo print. So that is fabric number 22. And from here we just need 2 5.5-inch squares. So no need to cut a full strip. Whether you're cutting from a fat quarter or width of fabric, it's not really going to matter that much. Just cut 2 5.5-inch squares. And I think we did this last month, where I'm just going to cut a little bit bigger, just because I've got some selvage down here I want to get rid of. So if I cut about a 6.5 by 6.5, then I can cut it down. There we go, 5.5, 5.5. We just need 2 of those. Okay, so we are now done with our cutting, and we are ready to start assembling the block. So to create our first unit, we need A's, B's, and C's. So we're going to join the A and the B together, and then we put a C on top. Now it's really important that the A be down in this corner. Don't kind of mix them up going this way. The A needs to be on the right-hand side. So the first step, go ahead, sew this together, and then we'll go to the ironing board. So set your machine up for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to do 8 of these units right here. So off to the sewing machine. Okay, here I am. I'm back from the sewing machine, and I'm going to head over to the ironing board. So when we are pressing these, we want to press them towards the B block. So that's the slightly bigger block, the 3.5. So we're going to press them this way. Okay, so off to the ironing board. There we are, back from the ironing board. Now, just before we carry on, this might be a good place to stop and check and make sure that your 1/4 inch is accurate. So these blocks that we just pieced should be measuring 6 inches. So if your block is measuring 6 inches, your 1/4 inch is absolutely perfect. If it's a little bit smaller than 6 inches, your 1/4 inch is a little wide, so make that adjustment. And if it is bigger than 6 inches, your seam allowance is a little bit too narrow and you need to go back and double check the seam allowance. So now what we're going to do, we've ironed all of these towards the A block, we've ironed all of these towards the B, well, except for that one and that one. That's better. Now they're all ironed towards the B. And now we are going to bring this is the C block. We're going to bring that down and we want to seam it across the top. Now it is important that this remain on the right hand side. So don't get this mixed up and put this piece over on the left. You want to make sure that it stays over on the right hand side. So go ahead, back to the sewing machine, and you're going to make 8 of this unit right here. So off we go. Back again from the sewing machine. So now I'm going to head over to the ironing board, and this time we are going to press up towards the C block. So that is our next step. Off to the ironing board. Okay, now we can take these and put them off to the side. Now if you are double checking, these should measure 6 inches by 6 inches. So you can always give them a quick measure, and if you have to do any squaring up, go ahead and do that now. But as long as you're 6 by 6, you're good. Now for our next unit, we're going to need your A's and your D's. And we are going to make a flying goose unit. So you're going to grab a D, and we want to lay an A down. We're going to sew on the diagonal and then flip this over. So it's very handy to draw a line on the back of the A's, because we're going to sew directly on top of that line. So if you flip it over to the back and grab one of your marking pens and just draw a line diagonal to diagonal, and make sure that you're right at the tip and right at the tip. And I would do that to all of your A's, and then when it comes time to put them on here, you can just line that up. Maybe if I do it this way, it'll make more sense. Line that up there. We're going to sew, so you line up your raw edges, sew directly on top of this line, and then what we do is press this back. We'll get rid of that bulk first, but we'll press that back. So that's the look that we're going for on this one. So go ahead and draw a line on all of your A's on the back from diagonal to diagonal, and then we're going to sew the left-hand side of our goose. So you want to make sure that your diagonal is going from the bottom left to the top right, and go ahead and sew that line. So that's our next job. Off to the sewing machine. Or drawing board first, draw your lines, then off to the sewing machine. And here we are, back from the sewing machine. Now before we head over to the ironing board, we're going to trim away a little bit of that bulk, because we don't need all that extra fabric. So it's always a good idea to do this too before you press them, because once you press them, then you have to fold them back over again to get that off. So what you're going to do is you're going to line the 1/4 inch of the ruler up on the line that you sewed. So there I've got my sewn line right there. I'm lining it up on my 1/4 inch, and I'm cutting away the excess. So make sure you're cutting on this side of the line, not this side of the line, because that will just be sad and you'll have to make another block. So make sure you're cutting on the correct side of the line, and go ahead and trim all those down. And then we're going to go off to the ironing board, and we are going to press these towards fabric number A. So it's going to be pressed like that. Okay, so carry on and then off to the ironing board. Okay, back from the ironing board and we are ready to put our second side on. So they're all pressed towards the A and we're going to put our second side on. Again, either draw a line on the block from this corner to this corner and we're going to sew on top of that line. And when you're done, we should have that overlap. So don't concern yourself that there's overlap. We need that overlap because that overlap then becomes our 1/4 inch seam allowance when we sew the next block to this one. So that's our next step. Back to the sewing machine, corner to corner on all 8 of these. So off we go. Back from the sewing machine, and here we are going to follow the exact same procedure that we did on the other side. Cut these little guys apart, and then we are going to go ahead and trim this seam allowance to 1/4 inch. So line your ruler up again on the 1/4 inch and cut off that excess fabric. There we go. And then we're going to go ahead and press these back again, pressing towards the A block. So get that trimming done and then off to the ironing board. Now, I quite often get asked, do we have to do the trimming? Can you not just go ahead and fold this back and leave that fabric under there? And yes, you absolutely can. There's no reason other than it takes away the bulk when we put this together. So if you're a hand quilter and you're going to hand quilt this, then you definitely want that bulk taken away. But your sewing machine doesn't really care how many layers are in there when you do machine quilting. It just does make the block lie a little flatter and it takes away some of that excess bulk. So I do generally like to cut mine off. Okay, off to the ironing board. Now one other thing, if you're really thrifty, you can save these pieces, sew them together, and have some nice little half square triangles for a future project. And there we are back. Now what you should have is these should be even across here, and you should have your 1/4 inch from here to here, and they should measure 5.5 by 3. So if you need to do any squaring up, go ahead and square that up now. Put them off to the side. We're done with that particular block. Now we are going to move on to our next unit. Okay, now we're going to grab our E's and our F's. Now we're going to do kind of the same thing, but with a little bit of a difference because these blocks are not the same size. This is a 3.5, this is a 3. So we're going to follow the same idea. You want to line up your top raw edge and your side raw edge, and we're still going to sew from corner to corner. So you can go ahead and draw the lines on the back of all of these, one diagonal, but we'll have this little bit sticking out at the bottom. And that will become seam allowance for when we sew it to another part of the block. So this one is about the same process as a flying goose, but we call this one a house. So we're putting the roof on the house. So go ahead and we're going to do the left-hand side first. Line up raw edge here and here. Sew from this corner to this corner. And then we'll come back from the sewing machine. And we need a total of 8 of these. So off we go. Okay, back from the sewing machine. We are going to do the same thing we did with the geese. We're just going to cut away that excess fabric. And then we are going to press. And when we press, we're going to press towards the E block. Okay. So we're going to press towards this block right here. But first we need to get rid of that bulk. So again, we're just going to line up the 1/4 inch on the ruler with the 1/4 inch sewing line and cut away that bulk. So we're just going to line the 1/4 inch on the ruler up with the sewing line and go ahead and cut away that extra bulk. And then we're going to head to the ironing board and press towards this block right here. Okay, off to the ironing board. Okay, back from the ironing board, same thing. We're going to take our squares line them up now with these raw edges right here, and we should have some overlap, and sew from this diagonal to this diagonal. So back to the sewing machine. Back again, and we are going to do exactly the same thing. We want to cut away this excess fabric and then press this towards this fabric right here. So that is our next steps, and then we just really have one more unit to make, and we are ready to assemble our block. For those of us who are used to making flying geese, this block is a little bit weird looking. But it'll look really good when it's done. So put those off to the side, and our last unit that we need to make before we can start assembling the block is our center block, and we are going to be doing square and a square, similar to what we did last month. We're going to take the corner, so on the diagonal, so again you may want to draw some lines from one diagonal, and we can do two sides at the same time. So you can do opposite corners, this one and this one. You just can't do these two because we need to have this flipped over before we can put this one on. So go ahead, draw your lines on the diagonal lines on the back, and you're going to sew corner to corner on two of the corners. And then we will trim those up. There, like so. Okay, off to the sewing machine. There we go. Trim these up. Same way we have, line up on the 1/4 inch. Trim. Trim. And then off to the ironing board, and we are going to press towards this block right here. So off we go. Okay, back from the ironing board, and now we are ready to put the last two sides on. So you're going to line up this raw edge here and line up this raw edge, and sew on this diagonal and this diagonal. Now, of course, remember, if you don't have the laser, go ahead and draw a line on the back of all these pieces, and then sew directly on top of that line. So that is our next job. Back to the sewing machine. Back again. Same thing. Cut that excess off. And then off to the ironing board. We're going to press again towards the triangle. And then we are actually done making all the units for this block, and we are ready to start assembling. That is so exciting. Off we go. And back from the ironing board. Now, just before we carry on, this should measure 5.5 inches square. So if you have to make any adjustments, you can make some adjustments here, but just be very careful if you are trimming this down. You want to make sure that you leave at least 1/4 inch at every one of the corners. So if it's a little bit oversized, don't trim down your corners. You're better off just to kind of leave it, and we'll watch as we're sewing it, we'll watch where we're sewing, because you do not want to cut those corners down, because if you do, you will lose your points. So now we're ready to start assembling the block. Okay. So we're going to start with the geese, like so. See what they look like. There, it's quite pretty. All right, so first step, on all of these, we want to take these and sew these together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And to preserve that point, you want to make sure that you don't sew past where these seams intersect. Where those two seams intersect here and here, you want to sew right directly where they intersect, and that will maintain your perfect little point there. So go ahead and sew all of these units together. And of course, we're making 8 of them because we're doing 2 blocks. So back to the sewing machine, and I'm back. Cut these apart. Now we're going to go to the ironing board and we want to press these towards this unit right here. And the seam allowance is going to naturally want to go that way because there's quite a bit of bulk right here where the tip is. So press towards the flying goose. Okay, now we are ready for final assembly. So take those units that we just made and make sure that they are pointing in towards the center. Just like that. So the first unit that we made, we want to make sure that the smaller block, the 3x3, is in towards the center as well. And just line those up like so. Okay, and of course we're making 2. So now what you want to do is sew this row together, and this row together. So with the pressing, we should end up with opposing seams, which is good. We have opposing seams right there. And sew that together, then sew that one on, and we'll continue down the row. So that's our next step. Off to the sewing machine. Now when we go to sew the center unit together, we don't have opposing seams like we're used to because we're joining 2 points. Right, so we're in those 2 points together. We want those points to be right next to one another, but there's no opposing seam that we can push together to make that work. So what I do is I take a pin and I'm going to stick it right where these seams intersect, right at the tip of that point, right there. So I'm coming out right at the point, if you can see that on the camera. And then I stick this also right at that point. Right there, and hold those together. And then what I will do is, leaving this pin sticking out perpendicular like this, I then take a couple of other pins and I'm going to stick a pin in on either side of that pin. So I'm going to stick a pin here and I'm going to stick a pin right here. And what that does is it holds that block together for me with those lined up exactly right on top of one another, and then when I go to sew, I can pull this pin out and then sew like I normally would with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, but that holds that seam together for me so that I have nice perky little points when I'm finished. And we're back. Now I know when we sew this together, that makes for a pretty bulky seam. That's a lot of fabric in there that we're going over. So I don't pull my pins out to the very last second. It's never a good idea to sew over top of your pins. But I will leave the pins here and here in until I'm just about there, and then I'll pull them out. And it does, because it's such a bulky seam, sometimes the tendency is for the feed dogs to slide over that seam and knock it out of alignment. So what I do is just a very last second, I pull those pins out, and it generally works out that I save both my points. So now that we've done that, we're going to head over to the ironing board again, and let's turn that one the right way. We're going to press this seam allowance out towards the outer blocks, this seam allowance in towards the inner block, and this seam allowance out towards the outer block. And then we've just 2 more seams to go and we're done. So back to the ironing board. There we go. What a difference a little bit of pressing makes to the block. So now we're going to sew this row to this row, and we will do the same line-up technique here to make sure that we maintain our points here. And then, of course, because of the pressing, we have opposing seams at the main intersections. So go ahead, we're going to sew this one in, this one here, and we're making 2 of them. So back to the sewing machine. And there we go, we are done. Just a little bit of pressing, and I pressed this seam away from the center. This is a really seamy little area right here. So the seam allowances naturally want to go that way anyway, so we just let them go that way. So that is block number 7 done. There we go. That is another month finished. So we have 2 of our 20 blocks done. And I think for next month, we will work on block 5 and one of the smaller blocks, block number 20. Yes, that's my dog. He's snoring. Block 5 and block number 20 for next month. But that's it for now. I hope that we can get together and I can see you on the Zoom call. But that's it for now. Happy sewing!